Welcome to today's ILTA pre-recorded podcast entitled You've Merged, Now What? Creating a Cohesive Culture and Work Product. I'm your moderator, Kendall Smarjeski, Associate Business Unit Director with the Banking and Financial Services Practice Group, Clark Hill PLC. I'm joined today by Stephanie Carty, a Corporate Practice Manager at Troutman Pepper, and our esteemed guests, Professor Chad O'Connor, and my colleague, Business Unit Director, Robyn Henry. Year over year, the legal industry continues to see an increase in mergers and acquisitions amongst firms. At the end of Q3 of this year, we have already seen 41 law firm mergers, which is a more than 10% increase at this same time period last year, and a nearly 25% increase from 2021. As more and more of these transactions occur, there's a growing fear of missing out amongst firms who have not yet merged. Jeffrey Lowe, a partner at a legal search firm, Major Lindsey Africa, has stated that people see their competitors taking action and they may ask themselves, why aren't we doing that? These mergers underscore that the world's biggest law firms have substantially grown since the start of the pandemic, adding depth and breadth to their services and presenting a major competition challenge for both big law and mid-sized peers, and do not appear to be slowing down anytime soon.
Yes, that's correct. And with so much movement in the industry and interest in this, it's important to take a step back and consider the impact a merger or an acquisition will have on both your culture and your work product. We are very lucky today to have two esteemed guests knowledgeable in these areas today. From Northeastern University in Boston, we've got Chad O'Connor. He is at the intersection of internal and external communication. He serves as faculty in marketing for undergraduate and MBA programs in the DeMoore McKim School of Business, and as faculty in the corporate and organizational communication for undergraduate and graduate programs in the College of Professional Studies. And as she said, from Clark Hill Law, Robyn Henry is the business unit director for the bankruptcy and real estate practices. She brings 20 years of legal administration and operations experience. And most recently, she's been heavily involved in the firm's mergers, more specifically acquisitions from both the acquired and acquiring perspectives. So we're going to start out with Chad here on the macro level. And Chad, tell us a little bit more about what happens during a merger or an acquisition when an employee, a client, or a stakeholder are left out of the communication loop, or they receive mixed messages. It can make them feel marginalized, sometimes taken for granted. From a communication standpoint, tell us a little bit about what are the keys to optimizing that communication, and how do you balance the focus on internal versus the external?
Sure. So, first of all, I think the problem you're bringing up is something that's totally natural, and it's going to happen. And you have to really consider, what are the restrictions that are being put in place by the people who are having to do those kind of conversations, right? So, anytime there's a merger or acquisition, there's just going to be certain kinds of information that is deemed sensitive, or that could, put other parts of that decision process at risk if it's out too early, misunderstood. You're kind of afraid of the rumor mill and those other things happening. So, unfortunately, by the time that info is able to be disseminated kind of more in full, you've had people who are probably doing speculation and trying to figure out, like, okay, what else is not, happening here? When's the other shoe going to drop? And I think there's always that kind of tension or uncertainty there that comes up, where people read into what's going on in that process with a sense of, well, how does this weigh out in terms of what's in it for me versus what's in it for the organization, right? Like, if I'm going to feel more insulted if I feel like, well, not only was this decision made, but you didn't consult me to really figure out, like, how is this going to impact what's going on with me personally? And I can put a lot of that aside if I'm getting more information that sort of says, like, okay, you know what, your pain points are going to go up, but if you look at the collective good that's going to happen for the entire organization, that's really going to be a big win, right? So, at that point, you sort of have this, I think, fairly rational calculus from how people look at it, and it's, can you follow up in subsequent communications with those people that kind of move them up one stage in how they feel about it, right? So, someone who walks into your office, it says, like, I read that memo, this thing looks like it's a disaster, there's no way in hell this is going to work because of whatever. um, you should be ecstatic and thrilled that that person, one, read everything, two, came into you, respects you enough to tell you that, like, hey, this is where I'm seeing problems, these are my fears, this is what we have to worry about, and you have to use that opportunity to try to communicate what additional things you can to really move them up, right? And back to the earlier part of your question and how this all kind of anchors in, all of this needs to really prioritize that communication going internally first, right? Like, there is nothing worse from a merger and acquisition standpoint to be like getting a note from someone on the outside who's not part of your company that's like breaking the news to you, right? So even if it's at the folks, block off time on your calendars, we are going to be able to make this announcement, and you can't give people the details, but at least so no one's going to be totally blindsided. I think that's something that has to be a priority as well.
Yeah, really great points all across. And the thing that you mentioned that really struck for me was when you've got that person who comes into your office and is clearly invested in the decision, that's what you want. You want somebody who cares. But what about those people? How do you handle it when there's resistance to change within the workforces after everything's already been announced and the original proverbial dust is settled? How do you handle the resistance to those who are still either head in the sand or don't want to talk about it, aren't interested, disengaged? What's the best way to handle?
Right. So sometimes it's swapping the messenger to figure out if that's the approach, right? Like someone is now bitter at you for the decision that was made in a way that's impacted them. But if they heard that coming from someone else who hasn't had that kind of bias loaded up on them, they might be a bit more receptive and thoughtful of it, right? So, one of the things to kind of think about is within your organization, and within the organization that you're going to be, merging with, who are the people that aren't necessarily in the formal positions of power, but do command that kind of level of respect with their peers from longevity or just generally well connected that can act as sort of a conduit or a go between within units to help you sort of understand where that communication problem might lie. So once you've kind of done that, you might not get the worst thing I would say in that dynamic is passive resistance to the change, right? Like that is the true kiss of death you're most worried about. If that person doesn't respect you and doesn't declare that they have no interest in getting this thing done, and then they're just going to look to I don't want to say outright sabotage it, right? But not make their own lives more difficult and not go along with what you're dealing with. You have to hope that you can use other people who they might respect more to kind of unearth what's going on with that and get a better sense of it, right? Like not saying you want people to feel like they have to be ratting people out, and going behind people's back,
Mhm.
but it is kind of crucial to have those other people that you can leverage within the organization to be like, hey, look, is there something I'm missing here? People seem to smile and nod their heads on that decision, but you're probably right to second guess it and try to figure out if someone else were asking the questions in a different setting, coming from a different person, does that sort of change what kind of feedback you're going to get around that?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And we know that there's so many different personality types, even generations in the workplace. It really is important to be able to be inclusive in your communication and the different styles. So when we're moving a little bit forward, the acquisition has happened, the merger has happened. Uh, to give some pop culture references here, and Lost when they meet the others, or in the Brady Bunch when the two families merge. Now everybody is one new entity. What's the most important thing to do on that side of it to not only maintain the positive goodwill, but to scale this new organizational culture and actually embrace the transition as opposed to either active or passive resistance?
Yeah, and I think that's where you kind of have to figure out there was a reason why you wanted these two groups to come together. And the worst thing you can do is to sort of make it into a shotgun marriage where everyone feels like they've been forced to do all sorts of things they are not happy with. And to a certain extent, we have other models that you can kind of look at to draw upon that show where this can be successful. Things like a holding company, right? Where there is sort of that, we have companies within companies here that you still have autonomy and a way of doing things, and that you should not be compelled at the flip of a switch to just drop everything, right? So if there is going to be certain transition events there that can happen over a longer time frame, where people have gotten more comfortable with each other and it doesn't feel like it's being forced upon them, then I think that's a really, great way to look at it. And it's really up to you as a management team to understand, like, okay, which of these things are we talking about where it is truly time sensitive? One unit is going to clearly take another unit over and say, like, this is how we're doing this now. And other units to be like, okay, we don't need to be as aggressive in that approach. It's not smart right now. It might potentially upset people who we think are kind of valuable and would feel like, screw it, why am I doing this? I have outs, I can go. So you really do, as I said, have to, as a leadership team, I think both leadership teams really need to kind of come together and understand, like, okay, what was the real motive here for putting this thing together, and to make sure that we're not just, willy-nilly arbitrarily putting forcing units to do things another way when there really is an advantage, not yet in the full culture of the organization, but even with subcultures, right? Like how units kind of operate that way. And when it comes down to looking at certain things that, in the grand scheme of things, might not make a big difference to some people. You have a system and a way of doing something. This other group has a system and a way of doing something. Is there really a significant competitive advantage between one and the other? If you can clearly justify that and use some sort of benchmarking or a way to sort of validate and educate that with the other people, you might make them less likely to sort of cling to what they think of was like, this is us and how we do our work, and how they kind of define, frankly, a lot of them, of themselves and their culture, based around that. So, things that I'm sure Robyn, would be able to speak probably better to, in terms of just like comparing different kinds of technology, where it's like, okay, is this really a catastrophic hangup, to make a difference between this one and the other one? Like, each of them has pros and cons. Do we really need to like force one side to do this now? And if the answer is yes, because there's a contract up and a huge cost savings and whatever, and like, you have to have those things built into the communication to really show people that, like, this is why we're going to change what you're used to doing, and it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary.
Yeah, and what's the saying? The only constant is change. So you get on board, and that's a really great segue to talk over a little bit more of the specifics that go into it. So I will thank you, Chad, and hand it over to Kendall and Robyn, who will give us a little bit more information. But Chad, please jump in if there's any more insight you can give to the questions that Robyn has as well.
Sure.
Sure. So assuming everyone's taken Chad's advice about optimal communications, once the merger or acquisition has actually happened, we all know there's traditionally an overlap in pre-existing roles and departments, with some studies, including a Harvard Business Review, saying that, up to roughly 30% of employees could be deemed redundant. Robyn, beyond early introductions and sort of kumbayas, what is your experience, or what can you speak to about integrating similarly functioning legal practice groups, as well as any insights you have into like those support departments?
Sure. I think there's three key areas as far as post-integration. Chad mentioned a lot of it already, that to get everyone on board, you want to have some of those events, you want to have communication is just so important. But first thing that I found is getting both sides of the team involved in leadership. So in my case, our firm was really acquired. It wasn't a true merger, but in experience, even at a true merger, you should have both sides of the table have a role, a seat at the table. So there should be a leader, and and it's really helpful, because it might just be one or two people maybe becoming the office managing partner in the case of legal, or being a practice chair in one of our examples. but the entire firm sees that person as representing them. So it shows that now we're not just going to company B and everything is about company B, that it's really a cohesive group of A and B together, and we're represented in these people. So I think that's important, to have a leadership role for, leaders from both sides. The second is, it's going to take time, but don't do business as usual. So you may, especially at your law firms, you have your team that you go to. You have some great associates if you're a partner, or on the opposite end, if you're an associate, you've always worked with partner A and B and you're used to their routine. We're going to challenge you to not do that anymore. Go to your regular team, but also look to incorporate and integrate those outside of your team. And it'll take more work, right? Because you might have to get on a phone call. You might have to look on the website who also has that level of expertise in the area you're looking for. But by adding some new members to your team, again, it helps with that integration. And though it takes more time, in the end, it's worth it. You're expanding who can work on your matters if you're a partner, and the associate then feels welcome into the new group, and they get to work with now more people instead of the same old. And the third is, it takes some ownership on your own end. And you can't expect, if you're an individual or employee at a merged firm, that everything is going to come to you. That, you will be welcomed. I was welcomed with open arms, but it's going to take some initiation on your part. And I got some great advice from our chief HR officer. I had before my role was completely thought out, she said, I reached out to her. I said, I have some time on my hands. What should I do? I'm in a satellite office, so to speak. I'm not in headquarters. I've met the Philadelphia people. And she said, just go and set up some Zoom calls. And that's what I did. I reached out to anyone and everyone who would reply to my emails that I thought I might work with. It might be someone in marketing, on the HR side, a biller who wrote to me. Any and everyone who was attorneys, anyone who was willing to, I took 15 minutes of their time. I said, can I have 15 minutes of your time just to meet you, just to get to know you, because I'm not used to working again in a national law firm. And I came from a firm in Philadelphia where I knew everybody, and I sat next to them and I knew their children's names. That's not the case anymore. So how can I get to know my colleagues? So that was on me to do. Nobody was going to set up those meetings for me. It was something, and it was so worth it. I met some wonderful people, and then when I did end up in my role, in my role now, I do have to work with folks across the firm, as Kendall knows. Then I knew, okay, well, this person, I remember when I was talking to them, they said they did this, or they could help me with this. So those are kind of the three things I would say, the advice on my end. To your other point, and it could be done at all levels. It doesn't matter whether you're a lawyer or staff. If you're a member of staff, mentor up, get a buddy. People are willing to help if you ask, but sometimes you're going to have to make the ask. And leadership can also help make those pairings. And they did that at our firm, and we've done that when we acquire a firm. So there's give and take on both sides. Yeah.
Any tips for, it's great to make sure that you're fully integrated with your colleagues as well. And I do 100% believe that initiating is always helpful. Any tips for the integration process rather from a technological perspective, when maybe it's less about combining groups, but more about learning a new technology or sunsetting your old records keeping to the new process?
Sure. Well, obviously, tech is going to be a huge part of a merger. And luckily in the law firm space, there's only, and especially when you get into a certain size of a law firm, there's only a limited number of softwares that most of us use. You might go outside the box, but for document management, for example, most of us are using iManage, right? Now, there may be a few on World Docs or some other document, or they're very small and they don't have a document management system, but we're lucky in legal and that those things seem to work themselves out, but you may also need the help. In a recent merger that we did, time and billing software is critical at a law firm, obviously. And we came from Juris. We use Juris. We're on the Juris platform, and now we're moving to the Elite platform, or 3E Enterprise. So what do we do there? And things take time. Some of that stuff doesn't happen overnight, and it's okay to be post-merger doing, you know, I think Chad talked about post-merger. Not everything is going to happen day one. And
Right.
to expect it to is, it's not realistic. And you have to sometimes manually do some of these things with the softwares, or we use your tools, use your resources, maybe even in the ILTA community. For example, we hired a company that was a pro at doing an iManage merger. And so, of course, we had folks on our end to map, because your fields, even though you both use iManage or you both use the same software, are not the same. And so you have to do a back end process on your own with your own folks over a weekend. We are involved in that. But hire experts who do these all the time. Use the resources that you're at, that are at your disposal, would be a tip. It's okay to do that, and sometimes really necessary.
Gotcha.
If I can dovetail off of the earlier point that Robyn was making too, and how that ties into what she was just saying, later here, which is great. I think the advantage of doing some of that post merger is also that it allows you to get more people into that conversation, to get a better chance of buy-in. Whereas if you're trying to compress it all into that very chaotic pre-merger window, certain people are going to feel like, I would have loved to put my 2 cents in on that, but I simply don't have the time and the bandwidth. And then they're going to resent the decision that was made by someone else. So I think, especially when it's coming to that, like, how are you going to assure that you have more buy-in on those processes? There is just a lot of wisdom of being like, try to stretch those timelines as long as you can, so that it allows you to get more of those people in the buy-in. And that also gives, perhaps some more organic opportunities for people to kind of meet and interact with each other and work on those sorts of things. Robyn, it was a great point for you to raise up, that, like, show some initiative and try to introduce yourselves to those people. But over time, you're going to get exposed to more and more people if you stretch those processes.
Hmm. And one question, sort of closing out question for you both, is there anything else that you think leaders of future merging or acquired organizations need to keep top of mind for their best shot at operational success once the merger or acquisition has occurred?
Sure. I'll take this to start. Two of my points would be clients and culture first and foremost. And I think that's easy to say, like, two biggies, because there's a lot involved in both. But make sure it's a seamless process for your clients. Sometimes they might get a little bit lost because they're going through something too. They've had this long time relationship with your firm on your letterhead with only your attorneys. And now overnight, almost, you're introducing them to a new, perhaps larger or different platform. So make sure they're considered. I'm sure they're thought of pre-merger, and you've communicated to them pre-merger before they hear it in the press. But remember to do it post-merger. Follow up, make sure that they're still getting the bills, they're going to the right address, that their rates remain the same, that there was no little blip. Hold their hand. Personally introduce them to the new team member. Don't just let Joe Smith show up on their next bill and they don't know who Joe Smith is. And so I would say clients are very important, and make sure they're not lost. Sometimes you'd be surprised, but we've heard of cases where emails are blocked because now you're in a new system. Make sure that doesn't happen, and be on the lookout for that. And then your internal clients, those are my customers, the attorneys and staffs at your firms, the employees. And that's where we talk culture. And culture is a general, fluffy word. But what I mean by that is, pick a firm that's a good fit for you. And hopefully you've already done that. And you have some things in common, and you have the same values, the way you treat employees, and show them that, introduce them, explain it, try to help your team members, expose them to all the wonderful new benefits of your new firm. I'm sitting next to someone here who was just promoted. She came with my firm. It was a goal of her to be promoted, and it couldn't occur at a small firm. But here at Clark Hill, she was just promoted to paralegal. And that made, that was her career. And that made me so happy as a member of this firm and my old firm. That was a career goal. Help your people help your people do that to achieve something they couldn't do in the former landscape. Show them the advantages of being at this combined place, and that speaks to your culture.
Great.
Great. I'd add into it a couple of quick things. One would be on the, just purely on the technology side of things in that decision making, what we would call first level and second level effects, right? So there was a reason why you adopted whatever you've adopted for your new system, but it's about really understanding what the trade-offs are and what the unintended effects are of having that happen, right? So as you're a larger firm and you're trying to figure out like, well, which of these options is better for us? Does it make certain people more or less dependent on other people because they simply haven't been educated and brought up to speed about what the reasoning was behind that and what we're really trying to look for in the benefit there, right? So you do have to sort of really, work through that. I think it is a great point, in terms of when you're having these bigger national firms, like you're absolutely right. Like from a culture standpoint, it's so much easier on a face-to-face. I'm in an office. I get to like just walk by someone and see stuff on their desk and ask how their weekend was and what's going on with their kid.
Mhm.
If you're in a bigger thing and everything's going to be on Zoom or whatever, I don't care how good the high def resolution is for you to see a person's face, but like you both switch off at a certain point and that's it. Like that's the end of the communication. You both get on with your lives. But like what other things do you need to adopt to help kind of supplement that in that
Mm.
process, right? So, that's just one example of it. You could take that through any, technology you're adopting. The other thing I would just kind of stress too in these situations are, as a management team, it really still becomes important to go through that process of trying to get buy-in to make the right decision, but that is not necessarily the popular decision, right? Like when people have finally come to an agreement and an understanding that one of these choices is better and this is what we're going with, it is really upon you to make sure that like people understand that and that's why, and that them actively fighting against it is not going to help the process anymore,
Right.
right? Like you can always put something in there that says we'll be able to re-examine this within a certain window so that people don't feel that like they've been permanently boxed into a bad choice. But really, it's not going to be in anyone's interest to just continue to fight against the choice when it's happened.
Mm. Well, Chad and Robyn, thank you both very much for joining us and for your insights and perspectives. I think it's safe to say this is going to be a continuing trend. So I hope those who are going to engage in mergers and acquisitions are able to put what we've learned here to good use and start the new year off right.
Yes, thank you both. And Kendall, thank you for being my co-pilot. And thank you all of you for viewing this. We really hope that you found this interesting and insightful. And for more great content, keep up with the ILTA Practice Management Group. We're going to have an upcoming piece shortly, co-authored by myself and Virginia Ong, who is the Legal Innovations Manager at Greenberg Traurig. That's going to be entitled, Keeping Your Team on the Same Page, the Benefits of Microsoft OneNote. We'll discuss the features and benefits of using OneNote for both yourself and your team and broadly with your organization. That'll be out next week on December 21st. Thank you again so much for watching. We wish everyone a great holiday season and a happy new year. Have a great day.